What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a DLC review for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's final DLC, Mysteria Ecclesiae. A big story expansion that puts us in the role of an investigator, exploring the Sedlitz Monastery, an area that has previously been inaccessible. But before we get into all that, important that I mention, I'm able to bring you this video, which is a day before the DLC's official release, because the game's publisher, Deep Silver, reached out and asked if I wanted to take a look at it, as I have been covering the game's updates and DLCs. In fact, it's my most played game this year by quite a bit, and a huge chunk of that was actually my hardcore all-negative perks run. But speaking of that, the run that I'm using for this is actually my hardcore all-negative perks character, and so the UI and stuff is going to look a little different. Otherwise, though, let's jump into this thing. Now, typically speaking, when DLCs drop like this, they are accompanied by a big free update to the base game, and that is going to be the case here. However, I do not have the full patch notes for that update, so I can't cover it in any great depth, but what I can tell you from the little bit of information that I do have about it is basically that it's going to be a lot of bug fixes, and then the updating of lip sync and facial animations for a bunch of languages that are not English, basically bringing them up to parity with the English version from what I understand. So if there's anything bigger than that in the base game, I'm not aware of it personally, but do keep in mind that is going to be dropping alongside the DLC itself. This is also probably a good time to mention that I did actually have one problem with the DLC, but it sorted itself out relatively quickly. When you get to the Sedlitz Monastery, it has its own map, which I'll talk about more in just a moment, but that map was completely blacked out at first, to the point where it just wasn't showing the map. And then after a couple of quests and some time spent in-game, it eventually just corrected itself and started showing it properly. Other than that, didn't run into any quest blockers, progression issues, that kind of thing, so hopefully that's the case for everybody else. But time will certainly tell on that one. Now, otherwise, in terms of what the DLC brings us, there's the story, which I'm going to go over a little bit here, the new location, Sedlitz Monastery, some new items in the form of a brand new sword, a new armor set, a unique Plague Doctor mask, some extra potions with some new effects, new skill books and lore courtesy of the library at the monastery, on top of a handful of side quests, activities, and exploration, of course. But let's get into that one thing at a time. First, how do you even access this DLC? Well, in order to play it, you have to first get to the Kuttenberg region of the game, the second area, basically. Once you get a certain point in, like the introductory quests of the Kuttenberg region done, it should allow you to then take on this quest in the city itself. However, worth a mention that it is still available after you complete the game as well, and in fact, there's some differing dialogue based on when you approach this. So if you've already wrapped up the main story, you'll hear some different things than if you are doing this ahead of the finale. Some other important things to note going into this, however. Once you start the DLC properly, you are locked into it until you finish it. That is to say, there's going to be a quarantine at the Sedlitz Monastery that is going to force you to stay there until the story is resolved. Once that is done, you can return to the monastery to pick up things that you've missed, but you will have to finish that story. And that's important for a couple of reasons. For starters, while you can certainly do this without having these skills, some skills that are really going to help you out with this in particular are stealth, scholarship, and some form of persuasion. Now, the reason for that is that those things come up a lot. One of the ways they sort of enforce this is a bit of item scarcity. When you initially go to the monastery as part of this DLC, you'll be stripped of your weapons and armor because it's a monastery, you see. So while you are locked in, you eventually have to gather up some resources to help you combat things like potential enemy combatants and everything, and it forces you to sort of find a solution that isn't always directly combat. At least at the beginning. You can eventually morph into that if you really want it to. But I did come to appreciate this, actually, especially doing it with a hardcore all-negative perks run. I actually found that it kind of encouraged some different solutions besides just, bashing your way through them, which I think is important because a lot of times DLCs and expansions that do this kind of thing don't always pan out, but I actually think they did a pretty good job with it here. Otherwise, though, let's actually talk a little bit about the story setup for this DLC. I'm obviously not going to go full spoilers on this, but I do need to explain a little bit about what to actually expect. So, when you start this DLC, the first mission is actually in the city of Kutenberg, where you're going to meet with Peter of Pischik, which I am probably butchering pronunciation-wise, but long story short, he asks you to accompany a doctor headed to the Sedlitz Monastery. As with most things in this game, there's some political stuff going on in the background of this. In particular, this physician is actually the doctor to the imprisoned King Wenceslas. He would like to go visit him and, assess his medical condition, make sure he's okay, but due to the political situation, that's a little difficult to do, and so he's going to go seek the favor of the abbot at the monastery, who is close to King Sigismund, who can potentially put in a good word to sort of facilitate this. Now, once you deal with an initial little bit of trouble, you prove yourself as a capable guard to this doctor, who then agrees to take you along to the monastery. However, it doesn't take long for things to quickly go sideways, because once you arrive at the monastery, you get embroiled in a mystery pretty quickly. People have fallen ill with a mysterious illness that seems to be related to the plague, but the exact symptoms don't exactly line up, which leads you to investigating so you can hopefully get in the abbot's good graces for the sake of your physician friend here. Now, that's about as much as I want to say in specifics, but as you would probably guess, this mystery gets mysterious pretty quickly. There's obviously more going on, but as the disease itself starts to spread and become more of a problem, the monastery gets put on lockdown, and this is going to force you to try to avoid being caught by guards, which is where the stealth element of it comes in. And while it's pretty forgiving in that regard, a high stealth skill will do you a lot of good here. So via sneaking around, talking to people, doing some investigations about how these people are falling ill, when, why, that kind of thing, eventually leads to this wider mystery that can then be resolved in a few different ways. I would say there are two sort of primary endings to the DLC, and then a couple of smaller things based on how you handle individual quests. But in performing a lot of that stuff, the investigations, the exploration, that kind of thing, you're bound to come across a few side activities as well if you're thoroughly exploring, so there is more stuff to do than just the main story at the monastery. And a lot of that stuff, all combined, is going to lead to the new rewards here. The new sword, the new armor, but one of the more unique things is actually the Plague Doctor mask, which unfortunately doesn't have the sort of iconic beak, but you are investigating an illness, and ideally you would like to not get sick, so one of the optional things you can do is actually go around and perform the steps necessary to craft a mask which will prevent the disease from being potentially caught in various circumstances in which you might engage with it. So I thought that was actually kind of neat. If you do the side stuff especially, and in fact just crafting the mask itself, you're likely to come across some new potion recipes. Now, initially I thought these were just like quest specific in that, they would have the use for the quest you find them in and that would be it. But no, they actually do have effects that are useful even outside of that. Like there's an anti-inflammatory one that gives you buffs to like strength and agility and gives you more experience for those over time, which is going to be useful generally for everyone. And then, as with any good monastery, there's a proper scriptorium and library, and that area specifically is just chock full of brand new skill books, new lore books, things that are really going to help you push your scholarship forward, which is especially important in a DLC like this, where those skills are, of course, pretty useful. So, long story short, a lot of rewards, but I did actually want to mention one other thing here. So I talked about how they take your armor and weapons when you go into the monastery. I was happy to see that when you exit the monastery after the DLC is done, they will ask you if you would like to keep your current loadout or if you would like to switch all of them back to what you entered the monastery with. And given how long you'll be in this DLC, as it's probably going to run like, I would say 6 to 8 hours for most people for the main story specifically, I was worried the loadouts would get messed up when you go to leave, but it does look like they kept that in mind and I didn't have to deal with it, and I was very glad I didn't have to sort all that out. But all told, in addition to a really interesting story that, plays into some of the political stuff going on in the background, you've got all these different rewards that are going to be useful even beyond the scope of this DLC. You've got this big new area that stays accessible after the DLC is over, which is important because you get access to like a bunch of herbs and convenience features that are like tightly grouped into a space there. So even after this DLC is over, I think that area remains useful as a place to gather resources, for example, as there's so much stuff just packed into a pretty tight space there because, you're locked in for a little bit, so they got to provide you the resources for it. So all told, I think this is a pretty cool DLC, honestly. I would say it's probably the largest of the total 3 expansions they've put out for this, the first one being a relatively short quest line if you'd finished the game. It's spread out across the whole thing if you haven't, and then Legacy of the Forge added like the building in the forge, of course, that you could manage, but that was a little more on the crafting and roleplay side of things and less about the story. But this is like a heavily story-focused proper expansion that I think a lot of people have been wanting, and I think it'll deliver for people for the most part in that regard, though it doesn't come with like some of the unique mechanics those previous DLCs launched with, like the shield painting or of course the forge management, the custom house that comes with that kind of thing. But they did do some really fun stuff here, and I think it's probably the best total experience of the DLCs that they put out. And so if you enjoyed the base game, I think you'll probably like this a lot. I would give people a little bit of warning about, maybe not jumping into this before they have a character ready via things like stealth or scholarship, or you may have a little less fun of a time if you're not willing to like engage with those systems. But for me, it was fun, and while I believe that pretty much wraps up the planned content updates for Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and in fact, I'm pretty sure that's a wrap on Henry's story actually, but regardless, whatever Warhorse does next, I'll definitely be keeping it in mind, as this was a tremendous game, and it's been fun to see it grow and evolve post-launch. But before I leave you guys today, I don't have the pricing information for this DLC. So Brushes with Death was pretty cheap. I think it was like $6 or $7. Legacy of the Forge was like $14, and then I think this one is a little bigger than both of those in terms of like actual unique content. So I'm hoping they keep it around like $15 individually if you don't have like the gold edition of the base game anyway. So long story short, as long as they don't go crazy with the price and keep it reasonable, I think this is a great DLC and a fun way to sort of end your time with the game as the planned content updates come to a close. But that's kind of where I'm at with this one, and I hope you enjoyed the video. So by all means, let me know what you think about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.